Sorry for the short delay. Welcome to everyone for one more edition of our university-wide inaugural lecture. And it's the second time in this new location. I hope everyone is happy. I'm very happy. This is one of our most beautiful lecture halls these days. And so welcome to the members of the TUD community and here in the room as well as in the stream. And welcome most of all, of course, to our guest of honor, Dirk Brockmann. You are our center of attention. And we are living in disruptive times. Wars and attacks on democracy, the climate crisis and the continuing loss of biodiversity, economic crises, pandemics, I could go on and on and on. All of these are complex, complicated issues that I think we all agree require a new approach. Also new forms of research to tackle them, to approach them, to hopefully getting closer to providing solutions. As scientists and research institutions, we are asked to make approaches beneficial to society in these times. And that certainly squares with our self-understanding at TUD. We would like to contribute to strengthen our resilience and to enable us to look into the future more confidently. And so today, it follows from what I just said, we are more than pleased to welcome an outstanding scientist to the TUD community who has made complex phenomena his quest. In doing so, he is treading innovative pathways to reveal hidden patterns, regularities, and similarities between different crisis phenomena and complex natural processes, which we hope eventually may allow for a new and deeper understanding of what is happening and how to intervene. I'm delighted that we have been able to recruit Professor Dirk Brockmann as the founding director of the Kids Center Synergy of Systems and as a member of our biology faculty. He joined us in October 23. So you may wonder, well, that's a good time of wait for the inaugural lecture, but there are good reasons. He is the founding director, so he was kept busy founding space and furniture and people, and he did. He did find them, and so today is the best day for him. Wolfgang Nagel, the director of KIDS, founding director of KIDS, I should say, and Thorsten, Mascher, the dean of our biology faculty, will tell you more and detailed about Dirk Brockmann. Let me just emphasize, Dirk Brockmann is a pioneer in every respect. He pioneered the analysis of large-scale data sets obtained in natural experiments. And he is a pioneer in understanding human behavior and human functioning based on such data collected by digital devices. We all remember that it was the heyday of these new types of data during the COVID pandemic, and that's where Dirk Brockmann was the go-to person in Berlin, and he also had one of his research groups at the Robert Koch Institute, so right at the center of where they tried to keep track of the pandemic. So during the COVID pandemic, he launched the German Data Donation Project, in which more than 500,000 donors provided data collected on their smartwatches and wearables on a daily basis for more than 2.5 years. This produced the largest data set of this kind in public hands, underscored. We will maybe hear a little bit about that from you later. And then in 2017, Dirk launched the Complexity Explorables. There's a website that goes with that, a collection of web-based interactive models of famous and less famous complex systems to illustrate the beauty of complex dynamical phenomena and teach students and maybe also colleagues about these very systems. So with this short preview of what we have gained with bringing Dirk Brockmann on board, I'm extremely pleased to welcome you, Professor Dirk Brockmann, and his family who is here with us today, Mona, Lou, and Karl in the top row there, as members of the TUD community. Welcome. So in his lecture today, Dirk Brockmann will ask a number of crucial questions, and I hope will provide some answers. What are the essential features of complex crisis phenomena? What defines them? How can we discern their essentials from what is negligible? What are their universal features and what their unique fingerprints? How can we think outside of the boundaries that define traditional scientific disciplines? I think the title gives you a little hint. How do we understand phenomena such as pandemics, social contagion, democracy, and social media? These are the questions that Dirk Brockmann and Synosys and the growing team is addressing. In 2000, Stephen Hawking claimed, "I think the next century will be the century of complexity," promising that an integrative approach with a foundation of new technologies, network science, data science, computational science, citizen science, with little regard to the boundaries of traditional disciplines, is the way to go. And we will learn that Hawking's claim is Dirk's mantra. Professor Brockmann believes in this intentional breach of traditional scientific boundaries for the greater good, what he calls anti-disciplinary science. And this is at the core of the Synosys Center that he has been building. It is devoted to complex phenomena at the nexus of life sciences, health sciences, and social sciences, and to transforming young and open-minded students into neo-generalists, another great term, that are needed to face the complexity of the challenges of nowadays. So I'm very optimistic that Dirk Brockmann once more will be able today to transform us in many respects. I'm looking forward to being transformed at the end of a very interesting day. And this point, I'm pleased to hand over to my two fellow speakers. First, Wolfgang Nagel, who will introduce Dirk in a bit more detail, and then also Thorsten Mascher, the Dean of Biology, to tell us about the complexity in biology. Maybe a little bit. We will see. Before I hand over, I'd like to thank, like always, the people we don't see and who made this possible. Thorsten Kombring, where are you sitting? Thank you very much. Supported by Christine Milkau from the protocol team and the colleagues from the communication office, Frau Selvig, I haven't seen her, and the ones who are helping us with the stream. Please don't run away afterwards if your head is too complex after the speech, because we will have a reception like always. And with that, I'm leaving the microphone and handing it over. Thank you very much for being here.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and also honored guests, it is clear I always take too long time. And because we have started late, my time is over. So I can stop here at any moment. So let us find out. It is with immense pleasure that I welcome you all to this special occasion. Inaugural lectures are always significant events as we can see. And I'm delighted to see so many of you here to share this. Dear Professor Brockmann, dear Dirk, as previously mentioned, you not only serve as the chair of biology of complex systems in the Department of Biology and Physics, but you also hold the position of director of the Center Synergy of Systems, which is key part of the CIDS, the Center of Interdisciplinary Digital Sciences, which is key part of the CIDS. And as one of the directors within the CIDS departments and the acting director of CIDS, I'm eager to elaborate on the strategic importance of this professorship for us, for our faculty, for the CIDS, and also for the university as a whole. Digitization is not merely a technical phenomenon. It represents a profound social process with far-reaching implications for society. It serves as both a challenging area of research and a crucial driver of innovation, forming a fundamental requirement for a modern and competitive work environment. Moreover, it captures significant public interest. This reality compels us to rethink established approaches and innovate across all disciplines. And we have heard about anti-disciplines, which we will follow up later on. At TU Dresden, we take a pride in our considerable expertise in both the application and the research of digital processes. To further advance this vital topic, digitization is recognized as one of the key strategy objectives in the excellence strategy of the university. The establishment of the Center Synergy of Systems is one of the outlined initiatives aimed at exploring digitization as a driver of innovation at TU Dresden, and Synosys was created to address the ongoing digitization of our living environments and the growing reliance on digital systems. It seeks to answer fundamental questions about how independently designed systems can interact effectively, the impacts of these interactions, and their inherent limitations. Dear Dirk, you have further developed this concept. The scientific focus of Synosys revolves around complex networks and their applications, also in social science, as well as in understanding collective behavior among humans and animals. Given your expertise in this field, one of the emphasis systems includes disease dynamics. And in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, I believe we all remember the significance of this research topic all too well. Understanding complex systems, such as pandemics, requires the collaboration of many disciplines. Synosys is inherently designed to be interdisciplinary, bringing together research teams that combines methods from computer science, maybe you should join our faculty also, network science, and data analysis with applications at the intersection of natural sciences, social sciences, and medical sciences. This interdisciplinary focus not only drives research forward, but also sparks transformative changes in fields where the potential of digitization remains largely untapped. This systemic and interdisciplinary approach will also greatly benefit your students. I'm confident that you will not only teach them essential facts and correlations, but also inspire them to challenge conventional thinking, question established models, and embrace enthusiasm for research. In doing so, you will help prepare the next generation of scholars and professionals to navigate and shape our increasingly digital world. The history of the Center for Interdisciplinary Digital Sciences extends back over a decade. Originally envisioned as the Lehmann Center, its establishment was decided as early as 2010, but we were waiting for the building. At that time, the focus was primarily on software development, and Synosys was not part of the Plant Center. However, between them and the founding of CIDS in 2021, with your help and strong support, the concept evolved into a more comprehensive and complementary approach to digital sciences. Today, CIDS is developing into a hub that unites over 600 scientists and serves as an international recognized lighthouse for digital research. To foster true innovation in this rapidly evolving field, the TU Dresden, through CIDS, provides a platform that encourages unconventional research approaches and the development of novel methods. This is our mission. CIDS encompasses not only classical digital sciences, services, and method development, but also cutting-edge AI methods, future-oriented research, a focus of the ethical implications of digital sciences, and a lab platform designed to make digitization tangible and accessible. Synosys fits seamlessly into the CIDS portfolio, complementing it like a perfectly placed puzzle piece. Since its inception in late 2023, Synosys has already become fully integrated within CIDS, and it is not only because we meet every second week in our directorium. It is much more than that. Several joint research projects are either underway or in the planning stages, and the initiatives have achieved notable successes with project proposals. Dirk, I would like to extend my heartfelt congratulations on the recent funding approval from the German Federal Ministry of Health, amounting to an impressive more than 2 million, I will say. And this achievement is a testament to the importance and impact of your work. Dear Dirk, we are very happy to have you here with us. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the inspiring discussion that will unfold today, later on. And with that, I want to hand over to Professor Thorsten Mascher, the Dean of our Faculty Biology. Thank you.
Good evening. What is there left to say now that hasn't been said already? Well, quite a bit, in fact. And it's my honor and privilege to introduce the person, Dirk Brockmann, as a new colleague, as a new chair here for complex biology. And that means making you familiar with a CV of the person. And that is down in a list of places linked to dates, timeline. And I could say, well, where he studied, what he studied. In fact, we overlapped in Göttingen while you studied theoretical physics for a while. But what I think is way more interesting in a CV is really to try to understand the person, the scientist, and the science behind the person through those timelines, through those places. And very often for us, if you look at a CV, it's kind of a logical, consequent thing that we do. We go from place to place, we go through natural selection, and we go our way. And it's a direct path. And very rarely we have it that the CV is kind of all over the place, right? It's kind of changes disciplines, theoretical physics, mathematics, biology, and this is definitely true for the CV and the lifeline of Dirk Brockmann, whom I'm very happy to have here. He's a trained theoretical physicist, but he developed soon in his theoretical training a keen interest in biological phenomena and questions. He applied mathematical tools, and he still does. And he also realized that the patterns that he saw could be applied to societal phenomena. And we heard the pandemic already before. So what he's doing is he's basically connecting things that seem to be unconnected through the patterns that they share. And that allows him, for example, from his own work, to connect how our eyes move if we read a text, and it's a chaotic movement that we see. How that connects to an albatross that flies over the ocean in search for food. It's kind of the same pattern. And that's bizarre and it's not connected, but the patterns are the same, the mathematics is the same. And because if you see those patterns, it allows you to apply the knowledge from one to the other through the patterns. And when I read his book, and I think it's a worthwhile reading, I must say I was super happy to see that as a preface, There's a longer quote by Lynn Margulis, and we talked about that, and we share our fascination by that scientist. Lynn Margulis is a person who was all her life fascinated by the complexity, or how complexity of life on Earth evolved. And she turned ultimately to microbes. That's what I like about that as well. So she became a microbiologist, but she's really a biologist all over the place. And that allowed her to connect things in biology that other people haven't. And you may or may not be familiar with this idea of natural selection and point mutations, so the Darwinian idea of evolution. And she was a fierce, fierce opponent to this. I mean, the epic struggles and words by war that she fought with Richard Dawkins, for example. And one quote that I use in my basic lecture is saying, natural selection eliminates or maintains, but it never creates. Yeah? For creation, you need more. You need, in fact, horizontal gene transfer, what she called symbiogenesis. And I'm mentioning this not because I like Lynn Margulis and because I know that Dirk likes Lynn Margulis, but because I'm absolutely convinced that what she means with horizontal gene transfer is to evolution what complexity science is to science. It's a means of building bridges between islands and connecting things that are unconnected, and thereby making a progress that is not possible by just step by step, gradually just going through natural selections. And it's this cross or anti-disciplinary approach that really allows to see those patterns, to evolve those patterns. Knowledge generates bridges is one of the key mission statements of the TU Dresden. I like the German version a bit more. Wissen schafft Brücken. It's a lovely thing. And in fact, saying that, it perfectly fits to what Dirk is doing. In fact, what he's doing is he flips the whole thing around. By building bridges between disciplines, he generates knowledge. So he just does just the inverse. And it's always through patterns. And that is why it's fun to talk science with Dirk, and we did already. That's why I'm super happy that we have you here. In fact, it seems like a quirk of academia, right? Or it could be like a scientific abnormality that we have a theoretical physicist in the faculty of biology. I would rather say it's a true honor and privilege, and it makes perfect sense if you see how his science evolves and what drives him in his science. So, as a microbiologist, I welcome you as a colleague and collaborator, and I'm happy to have you here. As a dean of the Faculty of Biology, I would like to welcome to your new, in fact, old house, the Faculty of Biology, because that's where you were in Berlin already. Welcome to you to the TU Dresden. I'm looking very much forward to your talk.
So, thank you so much, Ursula, Wolfgang, and Thorsten, for these very kind words. You said and mentioned a number of things that I'm going to emphasize in my presentation, which is a very special occasion to me. It's not my first inaugural lecture, but it's most likely going to be my last, given how much I like it here. There's also an age component involved, but let's not focus on that. Given that this is a very special occasion, whenever I talk about this particular topic, doing science like a fungus and complexity science, I show this picture, which is a drawing I made a couple of years ago. And I wasn't satisfied with this, given this event, because it's a silly hand drawing, and I wanted to do something special and make a special title slide. But I'm not good at that, so I figured, given we're part of a digital community, I'm not really good with using AI, but I figured I'll give it a shot. So I asked ChatGPT, could you help me? I need to make a slide for my inaugural lecture. The title is Doing Science Like a Fungus, Complexity Science in the 21st Century. And I told ChatGPT what I needed, and I figured, oh, it can do that. And so that is what happened. It's kind of interesting what's happening here. You have like these weird luminescent mushrooms and chemistry happening. I'm not good at that, and like weird stuff. I wasn't satisfied, so I figured I'll give it another shot. And I went through a couple of iterations, and it didn't really improve. And so I said to GPT, I'm not sure I'm getting a bit of a magic mushroom vibe here. And then let's try something else. Give me a Renaissance piece. Sure enough, it got the title right. So it gave me like the Last Supper with a bunch of mushrooms in the front row. And sort of a weird-looking kind of Jesus figure in the middle. And you don't really want to look in the corners. There's like some really weird organic stuff happening. And then I gave it the last shot. And this is the last slide of this introduction. I said, how about the 12th century? And so you have a bunch of like monks sort of praying to a tree, which I guess is supposed to be a mycelial network of a fungus or whatever. So that didn't work out. So the first part of this talk is sort of failing to give you a good title slide for this presentation. So you'll have to do with this. But the drawing kind of conveys what I'm going to be talking about, the way I perceive complexity science as kind of like a mycelial network, which is sort of the main body of a fungus, that connects traditional disciplines like ecology and economics, etc., in a way that it breaches the boundaries and sort of makes bridges, like Thorsten mentioned. So I'm going to be talking about that. I also want to talk a little bit, if I have time at the end of this, to talk about the new synergy of systems and how we try to incorporate ideas from digital health, epidemics, computational social science, and computational biology under one roof. Maybe I'll get to this. Let's hope I will. But giving this as a special event, I want to kind of give you a bird's eye perspective of how I look at this. So this is a bird and its eye. It's also AI generated. Did a pretty good job, I think. And it's a raven. Raven, you know, they're very smart. They can lie, they can cheat, and all sorts of interesting things. And quite often, they're associated with magic, you know, like witches have them and wizards and stuff. So I do also want to talk about magic. And you may ask, you know, why do I invoke magic in a scientific talk? Well, think about it. What happens if you see a magic trick? Some card trick, or David Copperfield going through a wall, or, you know, going into a box and appearing somewhere else. What happens to you? I can tell you what happens to me when I see something like this. Something really weird. Suddenly my senses are very sharp. I'm very alert. And something very fundamental is broken. The perception that I'm having, the observation, is fundamentally in conflict with what I think is true. And that's awesome. And it's a very deep emotion that is usually triggered in everyone. And we have talked about science, and Ursula mentioned like the very many problems we have to solve, like a pandemic. And that's one aspect of science, but there's also another aspect, which is kind of the energy which drives it. To me, I'm giving you sort of my personal take, and that's almost like the sensation that you get when you do science that is very similar to observing a magical trick. Being a physicist, I need to show you this. This is like what we think a black hole looks like when we're close, but not too close. And it's such an example. Like, you can dive into general relativity and into the theory of gravitation, wrap your head around Einstein's field equations and understand that this is a solution to it. But even then, it is going to bend your mind to an extent that it almost is painful. And that's awesome. And that's almost like magic. Coming to biology, wait, here's another example which I think is magical. This is a pistol shrimp. They live in the Caribbean, really weird organisms. They're like this size. And when you look at it, they have a particular type of claw. It doesn't have the pincers that they usually have. They have it here on the other side. But this one claw, instead of a pincer, has a hammer. And it can be cocked like a pistol. And then when it's released, the hammer goes into sort of a cavity, ejecting a liquid jet that moves at the speed of 100 kilometers an hour. So fast that the pressure variation in the liquid leads to cavitation, which is spontaneous formation of bubbles that then immediately, in a fraction of a second, collapse, generating temperatures inside the bubble between 4,000 and 10,000 Kelvin. That's hotter than the surface of the sun. Crazy. And it goes even further. Because of this massive, weird, extreme physics happening there, these shrimp are able to produce sonoluminescence, which is something that happens if you form, under high physical conditions, gas in a liquid that then collapses, and then there's a plasma potentially, and it emits lights. So this little critter can do that. And it does that to generate a shock wave to stun its prey and then to eat it. And that's magic to me. Well, I'll read about this and I think it's totally nuts. But it exists, and there are countless examples of this in biology. Now moving towards the stuff that we're doing, and I'm sure you have seen this. This is sort of a rendering of what the coronavirus looked like. But what you also see is roughly 30,000 letters. These are the nucleotides, the genome of the Wuhan variant of this virus. And this genome encodes roughly 30 genes, has about 14 open reading frames, makes 30 proteins. Or rather, it lets the host cell do it for it. And so this is the way it replicates. And it manages to infect to a good approximation, every human being on the planet. And all of that is encoded in 30,000 letters of a 4-letter alphabet. We know all this, but think about how crazy that is. And even against the resistance of the host, these 40,000 letters can do that. Magic, to me. So having encapsulated this kind of magical aspect of what complexity science is, and to me, it is a driving force of going into this field. And it provides you the energy to tackle the problems that are often also associated with many of these things. So for instance, this virus generated this pattern. This is a fast-forward recording of the first part of the dynamics of the COVID pandemic. And you can kind of see how complicated it is. This is sort of going up and down everywhere on the planet. 30,000 letters can do that. And it's part of a number of issues that we're dealing with nowadays, like climate crisis, political polarization, the biodiversity crisis, the way we disruptively changed the way we communicate on social media and networks. And many of these phenomena are very, very difficult to understand because they don't happen in one traditional scientific field. Like the pandemic is not a purely virological phenomenon, obviously. If you want to understand this wobbly video that I showed you, you need to understand the host. So you need to understand the psychology. You need to understand risk perception, compliance, vaccination behavior, the way we respond to a pandemic by changing our contact networks, which then feeds back onto the dynamics of the disease. So you have feedback in this. Typically, these phenomena are multi-scale, so from the nanoscale of a virus to the global scale, for instance. They're often driven by networks. In case of a pandemic, contact networks, mobility networks. And so the challenge is, how do we tackle this sort of phenomenon? And Ursula mentioned that one of my quotes that I usually show at this stage is this one by Stephen Hawking, who said in a millennial interview, when the journalist asked, the journalist said, 20th century, it's physics, we had cosmology, quantum physics, and relativity, and all the crazy stuff in physics, nuclear physics, etc. And she asked him, so what's going to be the next big thing? So the science of the 21st century. Probably expecting stuff like neuroscience or computer science or biology, because that was happening at that time. But he said, I think the next century will be the century of complexity. And he also explained what he meant by this. He meant that science is going to shift the focus, emphasizing trying to solve some of these pressing problems that are on the horizon. It's one of the things. The other thing that he meant is that we will have access to computational power, digital tools, etc., that will help us understand this stuff better. But he also emphasized that by, using this technology, we will have access to knowledge immediately, like everyone in the building potentially has one of those. And that means that everyone has access to the entire body of knowledge, to a good approximation, that mankind has produced. It's crazy. So Hawking meant that as scientists, we no longer need to gather all of this information and store it in our head. All we need to be able to do is retrieve it, connect it. And so he was also saying that there might be a shift in the way we do science, complementing the sort of expertise view in which experts know more and more about less and less until they know everything about nothing, by a more neo-generalist approach, where you try to build these bridges, see connections, and see and investigate similarities of phenomena that occur in different areas. So why do I call it doing science like a fungus? Now, being in the biology department, I want to just say a few things about fungi, because they're super interesting organisms. We actually do also a project on them. They're super interesting organisms. They have no nervous system. They essentially have no organs, except for maybe fruiting bodies. They can't do photosynthesis, so they cannot extract energy from the sun. They're highly decentralized, and they are masters of biochemistry to a bewildering extent. They also form very interesting individuals, like this one here. This is a particular fungus. It's actually the largest individual organism that we know. It lives in Oregon. The mycelium lives in the ground. It captures or covers an area of about 9 square kilometers and weighs an estimated 35,000 tons and is about 2,000 years old or older. So fungi do make the biggest individuals. And there's one crazy example I want to show you. This alludes to their biochemistry. So this was a paper appeared about like 12 years ago, where the researchers figured, well, fungi, they can cut into little pieces cellulose and lignin. Lignin is the stuff that makes wood hard. And they figured, how about we solved the disposable diaper problem in Mexico, because these disposable diapers make up a huge chunk of the trash that is thrown away in Mexico, like 6% and estimated. So let's make a big pile of used disposable diapers, put fungi in it, and sure enough, like after 2 months, all of the material was reduced by 50%. And an interesting thing they say in the highlights, the process reduces volume and weight, producing a high-protein byproduct with no pathogens. So fungi can transform poop into food, which is quite interesting. You know, we may want to not think about that so long, but they're wonderful organisms. And what they do is, because of their nature, they network. They build these mycelial networks that spread, looking for stuff. They connect. And they collaborate with other organisms, for instance, plants. Like 70% roughly of all the land plants, they work in a symbiotic relationship with fungi. But the most important thing in this analogy, doing science like a fungus, is this. They explore. And when we do science, in everyday life, I think, that's my gut feeling, that the very successful idea of exploration has kind of drifted out of science. And one of the things we need to do is to recover it. Why? Well, exploration is super important. Like, think about Darwin. You know, he went on a boat and sailed around the planet and developed his theory. That was pure exploration. Now, exploration is hard. It's super inefficient. Like, look at this. You know, these are the pioneers that discovered the West. Super inefficient, but very effective. You know, these two guys, they could have said, well, let's build a better cart first and then start. But then they would no longer have been pioneers because someone else would have done this thing. So exploration is inefficient but super effective. Like Darwin, super ineffective to sail around the boat in the mid-19th century, super inefficient, but boy, very effective. And when you do exploration, it's science more like with a compass than with a map. So you know roughly the direction, but you don't have a map. And quite often in everyday science, you know, we have to write a proposal, we have to be able to say what we're going to do in 3 years and what kind of results we would expect. That's not what exploration is. It's also important, but we need to explore more and provide the opportunity to explore. So that's why one of the things that we have as a motto for the center is we get lost in science. It sounds weird a little bit because no one wants to get lost really, but think about again what happens. It's like with magic. What happens when you get lost? Your senses are alert. You observe everything. You see everything. You try to figure out where you are. It's a different mindset. And when you have that, that's a very beneficial attitude and mindset if you do science. Given that I'm speaking at a technical university, I wanted to have at least one Star Trek slide. So it was not only with the pioneers back in the 1880s, but also in the future. You know, Star Trek, to boldly go where no one has gone before. And there's an important aspect in this, boldly. And you know that there are these three guys, the Trekkies among you know this. There's the bold guy in the center, Captain James T. Kirk, but you also need the brain, that's Spock, and you need the guts, that's Bones. And so like Kirk is kind of sort of the gut-brain axis in this trio. And when they work together and do this, they discover interesting things like papier-mâché aliens that are wearing weird scarves. So that's good. And another quote that I want to give you, it's one of my favorite. If you do this interdisciplinary or anti-disciplinary science, when you go into all sorts of different fields trying to make connections, you have to accept the fact that you intentionally seek situations in which you're not the expert. Richard Feynman, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, said, if you are the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. So seek out situations where you're the dumb idiot and then ask the right questions. So let me give you one example of how this could work. This is another magical system. It's a collective behavior in birds, and it's, when you look at it, it's weird how this happens, and scientists have been trying to figure out how this works for like a century, but it took a while until people looked at this from sort of a complexity science perspective. And one of the things that you do, it's sort of a recipe, you take this and ask, you know, what is really required to regenerate this? And one thing that you have to do is you have to reduce the system to the very ingredients that you need. And as you do this abstraction, you have to understand what you need and what is not required. Like if you make a model for a smiley, it's a good piece of information that you don't need the ears to make a face. It's trivial. But when you apply this to science or understanding a complex system, this is like the most powerful recipe. So let me show you just by this one little swarming example. So here's a little swarm, stuff moving around, and right now they're not interacting, but if you switch on these 3 interaction rules, like avoid collisions, stay with the group, and align with your neighbors, now they're switched on, these rules, very quickly you see collective emergent behavior, and it's quite interesting that that's sufficient. And in fact, when you apply this to schooling fish, this simple model is going to generate all the different swarming patterns that you observe in real swarming fish. So that's successful. But what makes it complexity science is that you realize, well, there are these rules and they look very simple, and maybe what is happening in a swarm is also governing pedestrian dynamics or crowd turbulence or the emergence of phantom traffic jams, like in the right little illustration. And I'm showing you this because the point here is all of these are agent-based simulations. The point is not that I can use a method like agent-based simulation to explain all of these. The point is that the underlying rules that govern all of these phenomena are identical or similar. And that creates a similarity between these things. So if we understand one, we understand another one. Those are kind of toy examples. So now I want to talk business, and I want to show you how this kind of attitude applies to real situations. So let's go into the topic of modeling infectious disease dynamics. So I'm going to show you this video again. So the goal is, how can we make sense of this, or at least partially? How are we going to try to understand the spread of an infectious agent, a virus, in the 21st century? Well, a good start is always to go back in time and observe that, for instance, the Black Death that spread across Europe in the 14th century did this in this wave-like pattern. And when you know a little about these processes, you will realize that this wave propagation is something that you get if you have local proliferation, so local growth, and spatial diffusion, so things moving randomly in space, but not hopping, just sort of local movement. And so sure enough, you can, and people have done this, years ago, decades ago, just write down sort of a little computer simulation in which, with these ingredients, and what you see is a propagating wave. So that's exactly what you would expect. And the good thing about a propagating wave is it has a constant speed in these particular cases, and that means if you see the wave, just like a tsunami, you can compute when it's going to hit you. And that's a good piece of information if you're expecting a pandemic. But that changes as soon as we modify our little computer simulation by permitting every now and then to have sort of a long-distance dispersal event. That's what you see on the right. As expected, the pattern is a little bit more complicated. Looks more fractal. There are all of these islands that were caused by long dispersal events. But the consequence of this is that given you are on the right somewhere, it's very hard for you to say when the epidemic is going to reach you. And that's a problem. So let's work with this analogy and try to figure out this. How can we, if we know there's an outbreak somewhere, at least in the initial phase of a pandemic, estimate when the virus is going to get to me? It's certainly not a wave pattern that you see here. So way back in 2013, we started looking at this. So this is an old stuff, more than a decade. But it was the time when we started thinking about this. We have refined it, but this is sort of the basic idea, and I can explain the basic idea with this old stuff best. So here's a figure from a paper that we did, and I want you just to focus on panel D. So this is the H1N1 pandemic in 2009, and what we plotted there is the geographic distance to the outbreak location on the x-axis versus the arrival time of the pandemic at a certain country. And you can see there's a correlation, a positive correlation, but the geographic distance, as expected, is not a good predictor of when an epidemic is going to arrive at a certain country, say. If you go to like 10,000 kilometers, there's huge variability. So there's a correlation, but in terms of like practical predictions, it's useless because of the air transportation network on which everything is happening. So the usual way to go about this is, given that, for instance, you have data on the air transportation network and you have a model, you can generalize this simple sort of lattice-like model, let's say. It's just computationally more demanding, and you can stick it into a big computer, and that computer does the calculation for you, and then you have a pandemic simulator. And at that time, 10 years ago, everyone was doing this. So everyone was like making very sophisticated models that included all of these factors, and then you had, push the button, you had an initial outbreak, and then you saw the simulation, and then it spat out the answer. But at that time, we figured, what if we've been looking at this in the wrong way? So with this sort of complexity philosophy, maybe sort of the traditional way of looking at it is not the right one. So the idea was to change the perspective and take the perspective of the virus. So imagine you are a virus, and you are on a host that is infected, and this host is at an airport, say JFK, New York. Then with a much higher likelihood, you're going to end up infecting someone in London or Frankfurt than, say, in Pittsburgh or Raleigh, North Carolina, those places that are closer. Why? Because there are more people traveling. So because you as a virus cannot manipulate where a person goes, you're just going to end up at one of those places replicating and infecting others. So what if we replace, and there's a math stuff behind this, more traffic with closer together? When you do that, then from the perspective of the virus in JFK, London and Frankfurt are closer. And now this is just a toy example, but you could do that for every location. So here's a little illustration of this. It's very hard to see, I guess, because it's black. So I'm picking Dresden as an airport, and I'm changing the traditional view and replacing geographic distance with this effective distance. So you can see that like Mallorca and a bunch of other places are fairly close effectively to Dresden. If I click on Frankfurt, all the major hubs in the world, and that also makes sense, are the closest locations. Let's pick another location. We're going to pick Conakry which is in West Africa. This played a role during the Ebola crisis, so it's right there. And if I rearrange it, I can see that Paris is the closest location, or one of the closest locations, and it's a gateway to the rest of the world, primarily because it's used to be a French colony. And so is this just a nice visualization and a way of looking at things that make more sense and are potentially helpful? Well, it turns out if you really do this and you run, say, a computer simulation of a hypothetical pandemic, here are two examples, and you show it in this traditional way, and the same simulation in this new way using effective distance, what seems to be complicated becomes very simple. Just a propagating wave. And that means the process is not more complicated than a propagating wave. And it also means that you can estimate the arrival time of a pandemic in your location. And that's of practical relevance. In fact, this is a 10-year-old thing, but as COVID started, we used this in order to estimate the arrival time of the virus in various locations. And so I'm going to show you this figure again, and panel D is again the relevant one. So here on the x-axis, the only thing that I did is I replaced in the actual data of the H1N1 pandemic the geographic distance by this new effective distance, and everything correlated much more or much better. So that means we can use effective distance as a predictor of when an epidemic is going to arrive most likely. Now comes the humor part. What is science without a little humor? Like I see there are a lot of also young people around, and I want you to not listen and not repeat what I'm going to tell you now. It's a little crazy thing. So when we published this in Science, and it's one of my most cited papers, but on the same day we published it, this is the paper in Science, I got a tweet by Johan Uganda, who's a great scientist. I don't know him personally, but I've known him like through his work, and he told me on Twitter, "Nice work, very impressed by your accuracy in predicting H1N1 outbreaks in Zamonia." Anyone know here what Zamonia is? No? Okay, so let me tell you the story, and so this is figure 2, and figure 2D, there are all of these countries, and one of them is Zamonia. And so sure enough, a few weeks later, like 6 weeks later, I get an email from the copy editing person at Science. "Dear Dr. Brockmann," I'm just going to read this to you, it's so funny. "Regarding your recent paper published in Science, we've received notice that figure 2D describing the spread of H1N1 influenza contains the nation of Zamonia, along with better known countries such as France, Spain, India, and China. This would appear to be an error, as to my knowledge, no such country exists. Based on the countries in figure 1E, I'm wondering if you meant Latvia instead. If necessary, we will publish a correction." And I responded, "Dear Harry, thanks for getting in touch. Let me ask, did you try to Google Zamonia?" And he responds like a day later, on the same day. "The reader who submitted this letter writes, not having heard of Zamonia, I looked it up. Zamonia is a fictional country in the fantasy novels of Walter Mörs. When I Googled Zamonia, I could find nothing more informative than this. Regards, Harry." And in fact, it is a fictional place, Zamonian in the German original. It's also very magic. It's a very magic place. And while I was doing this piece and the research, I was really into these novels. And the paper is a 2-author paper. Dirk Helbing is the other author. And I wanted to see, making the figure, if he would notice if I put ammonia in it. And he didn't. And then I figured, let's submit it. We did. I didn't tell the other Dirk. So we submitted it, and the referees were excited about the work, but they also didn't notice it. And then I figured, okay, the next stage is the editorial board, and they look at this probably and read it carefully, and they also didn't see it. And then I figured, we'll see if some of the people that read the paper will see it. It's a crazy idea. I'm never going to do that again. Because like Barbara Jasny, she is the editor at Science, when it came out, she said, this is unbelievable, and then she said a bunch of things that I don't want to repeat here. But we're friends now. And like 6 months after this, we met at the conference, and she said, she laughed eventually, and they said they will look at submissions that I do very, very carefully now. But we did manage another paper in Science after that, so they didn't sort of red list me or anything. But there was also positive feedback. So like Johan Uganda wrote, "Hi Dirk, it's really funny and it's fantastic to pull this off in Science. I don't think the entertainment detracts one bit from the work being serious at all. Definitely count me as an ally here. I've yet to plan something of the sort in my own papers, but I aspire to, and you set an excellent example. There's also an important message of humility inherent in this, admitting, showing that peer review is not a catch-all, something any scientist knows. Rest assured, I applaud you." So that was positive feedback, but I haven't done it since. And there are a bunch of people in my group, and please don't do that to me also. So another thing, I have a little bit more time, that we do is we try to understand human mobility. Especially in pandemics, this is important. So during the pandemic, we had access to a lot of mobility data that is derived from cell phones. And a bunch of people are in the audience that actually are visiting from Berlin and that analyze this data. And one of the things that we needed to understand better is how we respond to a pandemic, because it's a feedback. It's not sort of a passive spread. We respond to it. And one of the things we could measure this by is mobility. And so one of the things that we did during the first lockdown, we looked at how mobility decreased, but also how these networks changed. And that was very insightful, especially when when people went back to their normal business. And one of the things that we tried to show in this paper is how essential it is, or like in what way does mobility reduction impact disease dynamics. But there's also another element of it, and yesterday I showed it in in a sort of fishbowl format that was organized by the Department of Speculative Transformation. That was fun, and that was about art and science. And one of the things that I also think is essential for complexity science is having the perspective of artists look at what you're doing, because it's a different perspective, and quite often it doesn't amount to anything, but then every now and then it does, just like exploration, super inefficient, but every now and then super effective. And so here's a little thing that we did. It's barely visible on the screen. This is data that was collected on my phone on Google Timeline, so how I move about in Berlin. So you can see like the bright areas are the roads that I take from home to work and back, and the public transportation and all the other places I go to over a course of about 2 years. And back then we analyzed this, or we didn't, but one of the guys that was essential to the success of my team in Berlin, Ben Meyer, a genius. I would love to have him here, and I'm still working on him. One of the smartest people I have met. And so he made this figure, And then we figured, okay, let's do it in a different way. So he made this map of Berlin. That's his timeline. And you can see up in the top left, Ben Meyer. So that's sort of a color-coded version of where he spends a lot of time, but you don't actually see so much. Spends more time in the center, essentially. But if you make this move, the first thing is you can temporarily resolve this by the time of day. And then you can already see there's kind of a rhythm. But now, watch what happens if you do something that's called density equalization. You blow up the areas where he spends a lot of time and reduce the areas where he spends little time. And then you have a pulsating heart. How beautiful is that? And then he called it Heart of Berlin. I'm trying to convince him that this is a piece of art and we should do like a citizen science project where lots of people donate their individual data, and then we have lots of Hearts of Berlins, or like last night we were talking, maybe let's do this for Dresden. Yeah, Heart of Dresden. So, but what you see in this is that there's actually not a lot of complexity in individual mobility patterns on a daily basis. You go to work, you go home, you go to work, you go home, you go to work, you go home. That's how we live, mostly. And that makes this pattern simple. And the artistic rendering kind of conveys how this can be done. And then finally, that brings me to this idea of citizen science, and Ursula mentioned this. A big project that we launched during COVID, and we can continue it here now because we have been given a lot of money for it, is the data donation project. And so in a nutshell, the idea was this. We ask people to donate data collected on their wearable devices. That's heart rate, step count, and sleep patterns as a function of time. So for every person that participates, we know the heart rate every day, say. Also on a finer scale, but let's forget about that for a second. And the original idea was to see if deviations in heart rate due to an infection or fever, you know, like you get an infection, you get fever, and if you have a large population, the idea was to see if we could in real time monitor COVID in the beginning of the pandemic, because there were no tests and, you know, it was horrible, like the reporting system wasn't set up, etc. So that was the idea. This was super hard, and Annika is here, and she did, like, also David, most of the work, you know, making these algorithms work. And so it's like 500,000 people that donated data. We have more than 100,000 people that donated a long time series. And we just have analyzed the tip of the iceberg in this. And it's a great example of exploration, or like a ground for exploration. We can be pioneers in this. It's huge. One of the things that this new funding initiative is focusing on is long COVID. So can we see in this large body of people that participated conditions that, say, increase the likelihood of developing long COVID, which we can also see in the data. For instance, this was a paper, the first paper done on this, where you can see the response of the heart rate. This is the average. Changes, or it's still different from the baseline 90 days after an infection. And for some people, that takes much longer. So we really want to dive into this data set, also into the high resolution stuff, and understand long COVID better. Something we didn't have on the radar, obviously, when we made that data set. And then Annika, she is really into sleep. She's trying to understand sleep better in the country, along with Paul, who's also in the team. And this is just a figure from a paper that we're just about to submit that essentially contains a bunch of sleep maps in the country, and, you know, analysis of how it is still bound to the sun, east-west, and how it is different in urban areas and suburban areas, how it is different on the weekends and the weekdays. So this is just observational stuff, but it's all in the data, which we didn't have on the radar. And then there's like crazy stuff, which we still haven't figured out yet. This was one of the first plots that we did with the data, is called the pulse of the nation, the average resting heart rate in the different counties, and it's higher in the east than it is in the west. and it's also different. It was different in the second pandemic year, etc. So they're like, but this is systematic, and we don't know why this is. So if you want to work at Synosys and try to figure this out, you're welcome. And so let me use the last minutes to talk a little bit about the philosophy of this new center synergy of systems. Like I mentioned, we have different topics. I mostly focused on some of the examples from infectious disease dynamics and digital health. We have a young investigator group led by Philipp Lorenz-Spreen, who started last October. He's doing computational social science, democracy, and social media. It's great, and if we're lucky, we're going to be able to recruit a person working on computational biodiversity, and all of this is happening under one roof. And the idea is that when people are there, they don't even know where they're coming from. So they talk to one another without a bias of where they're coming from. So that's the idea. And I mentioned this earlier. It's not a center in which we do a lot of computational digital work, but that's not the point. We don't want to be bound to the tools that we're currently using. We want to understand the systems that are connected with similarities and similar rules. And if by juggling with wine bottles, it will help me understand the pandemic, I will surely enough learn how to do that. That's the idea. Not to be bound by methods, but by the systems that we're interested in. So it's not, that's why it's called center synergy of systems and not synometh, which sounds like a drug. So finally, there's another element, and that's my last message. We have these amazing rooms now. Took some time, but we accomplished it. In order for this to succeed, you need a certain environment. And we were able, here at this university, to make a for a university, I think, very unusual environment. But this is very essential. It's like the soil on which the stuff grows. And this is a picture, it's sort of a new work environment. This is a picture where we meet and discuss. And in one of the events about new work here, I gave a presentation on our new work. And there was one person in the audience, an architect, I think. And after the presentation, he said, this looks like crap. And this is, it's not contemporary interior design, it's not fancy, who do you want to impress with this? And I'm like, and he said, this looks like a children's place. And I said, exactly. That's what we need. We don't want to impress anyone with colorful sofas. We need to generate an environment when the people go there, to some extent, they behave like children. Children breach boundaries. They don't care. They care zero about what you think about them and what they're doing. And they can bend their mind to an extent that we can't anymore. So we need a little bit of this. And if I can make this happen, I will do it. And it's not our idea. There are other places that have been very successful doing it this way. To provide an environment so people think more like children. Like Picasso said, it took me 4 years to paint like Raphael. It took me a lifetime to paint like a child. And what he meant by this is that children can do stuff that adults have forgotten. So that's it from my end, but I wanted to zoom in here and mention and show you the center, the people that drive it. That's the team at the moment. We're roughly 19 people. We've got a lot of money now, and so we're hiring. We have 12 desks, I think, maybe 14. But we're 19, and we're going to be 23, 25 very quickly, so we need more space. So that's it, and I thank you very much for your attention, and I think I've made it right on target, right? Yeah. All right. Should I stay here or should I sit down?
No, that's fine. I just stand here. So, thank you so much. That was a broad overview, bird's eye view, as you promised, over a lot of things. You covered quite some ground. I guess there must be the one or the other question, potentially, possibly. Anyone who dares asking the first one? There's one in the back.
The mics.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was really exciting. I'm working on collective motility, and there I'm always like, what struck me the most is that these collective dynamics used to break down if you have uncooperative individuals in the collective.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. Okay.
And so an interest of mine is how actually like collectives form decisions. And in politics, there are sometimes numbers that appear, like 5% or 10%, in order to form a decision. Could you comment on, first, do you have a feeling how these numbers come into existence? Are they randomly picked? Or is this actually a value that is meaningful from a physical perspective? And then how these collectives react to uncooperativeness?
So I can tell you a little bit about my experience with numbers, especially like threshold numbers that like segregate one behavior from another in epidemiology and like applications of like computational epidemiology to real systems. And there it seems here and there a little arbitrary. So we had like a bit of this problem when we were doing COVID vaccination papers, and they contain numbers, but they're often, there are error bars connected to them. But when something is conveyed in the public or the media, they only talk about the averages and don't convey the variation that is in there, and then some number sticks, which is often not a good estimator. And concerning your particular system, I have no idea, but I think we need to talk. So visit us and what? Like a collective having uncooperative individuals? Do you have this too? In a collective of uncooperative individuals? You have a collective and a subset of the collective is uncooperative. So that reminds me a bit of another set of swarming systems. I think Hiroki Sayama made a few of those, where the individuals in a swarm behave according to different rules. So some of them repel, some of them attract, some of them align, some of them don't align, some of them misalign. And then you can have very quickly all sorts of really weird patterns that emerge. And I only learned about it actually in a talk quite recently at the Max Planck Institute here, Physics of Complex Systems. And I didn't know about this. And I knew Hiroki, and when we touch base because we want to do an explorable with this stuff. But that was quite new to me, that if you have like different behaviors, you can have all sorts of really unexpected patterns. I don't know how specifically a set of uncooperative individuals would change the shape. This sounds a little bit like game theory in swarming, and so I'm too shaky. I cannot answer that.
Beautiful. I love the exploratory data science, yet for many interesting questions to ask, there are data protection regulations that limit data accessibility, and you go forward with volunteers donating the data, which may or may not create a selection bias. So I'm curious how you're dealing with these challenges.
So in these citizen science projects, and this is like one of many we've done in the past, sort of like analyzing data that is collected in a natural experiment, so not with a scientific intent. So it's either you look at data that was collected in a different context, but it has very many biases, or it's dirty, and you know, like all the people that have been working with me for some time, they have aged because they are dealing with large-scale, very dirty data sets. That is quite nerve-wracking. And on the other hand, you have like the citizen science projects, which have a massive selection bias. So that's true, and they are useless in addressing certain questions for which you need sort of a representative cohort. But again, there are some things that you can extract that are so strong, the signals are so strong, that it would make no sense to assume that this is not happening in a representative sample. But you will have to go and check whether it's actually the case. So, like the impact of the resting heart rate in response to an infection. So that's a massive long tail. But obviously, the cohort in this data donation project are more health-aware people. They have a smartwatch, you know. Many old people are not in there. Children are not at all in it. So whatever you say is only for this cohort. Sometimes you can extract sort of a representative cohort from this in a certain age bracket, but then you make the sample a lot smaller. So it's more like a complementary way to go about this. And I've once given a presentation, and someone in the audience said, well, the gold standard of medical research is sort of the randomized representative, whatever it's called. And that really puzzled me, because if there's one thing absent from science, it's a gold standard. If you look at the history of science, like what was the gold standard of Darwin? Sailing around the planet, developing one of the most influential theories of mankind. It was absent. Well, it was also absent from the theory of relativity. And so, you know, you have to contain multitudes. So that's like one thing, and it gives you information, and then there's another thing. It gives you information. You can look at the differences and the similarities. So it's like sometimes we get caught up in like these weird discussions about whether you should do it this way or you should do it that way. Do it both ways and then see what the message is. And we do of that too little. I got drifted away again about like philosophy of science stuff.
Thank you, Dirk, for a very inspirational talk. Crossing boundaries between philosophy of science and trying to understand human behavior. I want to shift a little bit because systems can be about different things. And one of the specialties of our TUD is that it turns out a number of coordinated research projects are interested to cover different scales within one project. Mm-hmm. One of the highlights, which is still vivid in my mind because we just defended it in Bonn, is physics of life. Yeah. It starts within the cell, and it goes on to tissues, and it goes on to organs.
Yes.
Further, they haven't ventured. So what would you say, or do you have insights about hierarchically locked systems in how to understand whether they are joined by synchronicity or similarity or asynchronicity? So I would find that really exciting because physics of life is all about joining the forces of two big disciplines, which is physics and biology. And so you have these very different types of data, and you have them staggered across hierarchical levels. I would be really interested in your insights.
So this idea of connecting different layers of description or scale has been kind of taking off in network science. And if we're lucky, we're hosting the network science in 2027. And so there's an increasing, exponentially increasing amount of efforts trying to understand systems like this by multi-layered networks. I know a bunch of stuff where this is applied to disease dynamics. In fact, we have a guest from Chile, and he is developing a computational modeling framework that goes from a contact network level, where individuals contact one another, and they form like a local network, like a population. And then you have the next layer where you have coupled populations, so like people going from A to B. And that forms then a meta-population. And there are quite a number of open questions how the different layers impact the overall dynamics, say, of then a spreading phenomenon. That's one area where I think this is, it's kind of taking off. Another one, this is why I'm so excited about this Eminöter application for the biodiversity of the deep sea animal forests, which I know nothing about, or I did not know anything about first. I know more now. And the idea is there to use a system that also captures a number of layers. These are like cooperative ecosystems. They're very special in a lot of ways because it's animals, and they form all sorts of symbiotic relationships, and there's more and more data on them. They're super important for like the stability of the marine ecosystem. We know nothing about them, but like when they're gone, like we're gone. So it's important to study them. And I know that the person who applied for this wants to investigate this essentially in this multi-scale hierarchical fashion where you have tiny cooperation, symbiotic relationships, which can be on a very small scale, like bacteria with animals and the bacteria and the holobiont of this organism, they work together, and then they work on a coral reef, and it goes up and up. And she's trying to understand this in this multi-scale, multi-layer network modeling way, which I haven't seen before, and I think it's super exciting to me. I've read up on it, and when she applied, I had like no idea about deep sea animal forests. It was like a weird term to me, but that's another aspect of this. Like if you work in an environment like this, you walk in and then like you learn something about this stuff that you have no idea about, and it's so exciting. So that's kind of the environment that I want. I think it's going to be great if Synosys becomes that.
So we already realized that complex systems lead to complex questions, generating complex answers. There's one more question here, maybe one additional one, and then I think we have a reception. We can address Dirk and all the questions there. So one question in the back here.
Thanks for the very interesting talk. I have a question about this effective distance theory.
Yes.
When my Chinese students came back during COVID time to Germany, they were shocked that nobody was interested, for instance, in their body temperature at the airport. While when you travel to Asia, you probably know every time you are checked. Do you see such effects in the effective distance theory?
No. So, I mean, one has to understand that this is like an approximation that extracts information only about the mobility. And the question is, how much can we explain using this? And when you actually do that, there's a lot of variation, and there are outliers, etc. There are cultural imprints that are very visible in certain things, but not on the scale of description on which this is happening. So this isn't in it. Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for a fascinating talk. It was very nice to listen to you. I would like to come back to your smiley with the ears.
Yes.
Because I realize also when I teach for students, so I feel that it's not really the spirit of our time to make things simpler. Yeah. It is more making everything more complex. And So what are your strongest arguments for saying we really have to simplify things to understand them?
Well, that I can answer that on two levels. So I think one, what's Strömung in English? Like one fashion, I guess, is that, yeah, one trend, thank you. So I don't know why it is. I think it's because we're sort of like individualized very strongly. Sometimes we tend to focus on differences a lot. And we say, you know, oh, this is a birch tree and this is an oak tree. Look at the differences. They're at different height and, you know, different all genome and all of the differences. It's one way of looking at it. And then you can look at the two trees and you see these similarities, the fractal structure. Also a way of looking at it. And when you do that, that's my personal, very personal take. If you look on the similarities, you're more likely to find something that is universally connecting the two. Because there are like a gazillion ways to be different, but there are only very few ways to be similar. And it goes also to, you know, I could like lecture all about this, and we've had long discussions about that. We often, you know, we emphasize how different everyone is, you know, and how great that is, and that's true. But if you think about what liberated societies, what made them more egalitarian, is a focus on similarities. You know, you and I have, everyone here in the room has a hand. Weird, right? So, like, we focus on, like, we always talk about differences and uniqueness, but if we focus on similarities, suddenly it binds people. And when you look at innovations, I'm not an expert, but that's my naive take. Like, every step forward in society, or many of them, were derived by accepting a similarity. And that's related to simplification and complication. So as you make things more complex, they become more unique. But like a smiley, it's a face, like everyone in the world will recognize it. And so the value of it is that it makes you understand things better, and it shows similarities in a way that it doesn't turn everything into a uniform collective. And, you know, you walk in if you walk through a jungle, like the Amazon, the species diversity is so high that I read that on 1 square kilometer, there's on average one representative of a plant. It's crazy, yeah? So the diversity is so high. So you walk through this and you say, great diversity, and it's beautiful, but they're still all plants, and they share features. Sometimes they're very awkward and unique. And it, of course, makes more sense, or it's more fun to walk through the jungle than through sort of a monoculture where everything is sort of a wheat field. That's boring. But nevertheless, you can focus on the similarities, and I think that's, to me, related to simplification and trying to wrap your head around this. It's like a card trick, like magic. Like some of these card tricks, they have like many elements to it, and they are what fool you, and there's one little element in it. That's where the card trick is hidden. And so, yeah, I guess I just like it.
So I would like to thank everybody for asking questions, for the discussion. I would like to thank Dirk again for this fascinating insight into his brain, basically, and how he thinks and works.
Thank you for coming, everyone.
So, thanks, first of all.